Ethan Klein needs to stop talking about Palestine because this man cannot take even the mildest of criticisms. He cannot reflect on any of the things that he has actually said. He wishes to live within a world in which neither he nor Hila have ever done anything wrong, that they are both actually some of the most pro-Palestinian content creators out there. And I had initially written out a whole script talking about Ethan Klein's first podcast episode reacting to iDubbbz's Content Cop because it was filled with many hilarious gems, such as when Ethan called Israel an inspiring example of coexistence. But there was one part of his second podcast episode reacting to iDubbbz's video which really leapt out to me, and it has derailed what I wanted to say really, because in it Ethan compares the experience of his wife Hila to that of Anissa, iDubbbz's wife, a Lebanese person, making it out as if Lebanon could in any way be portrayed as an aggressor who bears the same responsibility as Israel.
Part of the Lebanese, they've received a lot of oppression and attacks from the IDF. So Anissa is very well
And sir, do you happen to know of any violence perhaps coming towards Israel where Hila grew up? Perhaps from Lebanon, Hezbollah, perhaps? Does that ring a bell to you, you dumb, ignorant? How dare you attempt to lecture me on this conflict? You just learned about this like 2 weeks ago, clearly, and you're just deferring to Hassan as an expert. It's mind-bendingly dumb. Bro, please call in and debate me on Israel-Palestine. Let's see who knows more about the conflict.
Now, I really hate how smarmy Ethan is in this clip. He makes out that he's some kind of expert on Israel and Palestine, when I, along with many other content creators, have exposed his totally lacking knowledge in this. And this is really a constant theme throughout both his podcast episodes, because he goes on and on about how proud he is of the content nuke on Hassan, how well sourced it is.
Bro, he loves that out of context thing. Like, that video was so well sourced. The full context to everything.
But Ethan, in the first episode, literally pulled a fake quote.
Thinks Nasrallah is based, the guy who says, we will hunt down the Jews wherever it's better that the Jews all go to Israel so that we don't have to hunt them down worldwide.
From that content nuke attributed to Syed Hassan Nasrallah that Ethan ripped from Wikipedia and then blackbarred so you couldn't see that even the Wikipedia article noted that the quote was most likely fake. Now, as much as Ethan loves to talk about Middle Eastern Jewish people and how they came to Israel, what I will say is Israel is undeniably a foreign implant in the Middle East. I mean, one of their key founders, Theodor Herzl, literally said of Zionism, "We should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism." And this is exactly what the Zionists saw themselves as doing. They practiced colonization in another people's land, and they saw themselves as redeeming it, doing away with the years that it had been in the hands of the useless and evil Palestinians. But ever since its inception, Israel has spent its time trying to alter the politics of the Middle East. And here, Ethan, I will note a difference between you and I, and also people who support you, because unlike you, I don't really draw that much from Wikipedia, unless I just want a quick source and I know that I have others to back it up, that is. So I will quote to you from 1949, The First Israelis, by Israeli historian Tom Segev. Now, Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, said, "The Muslim rule in Lebanon is artificial and easily undermined. A Christian state ought to be set up, whose southern border would be the Litani River, then we'll form an alliance with it." Now, this is basically Israel's first Prime Minister talking about demographically altering the country of Lebanon, getting rid of the Muslim population, and setting up a majority Christian state simply because it would be friendly with Israel. And Israel actually went on to do this. They sowed chaos in the country of Lebanon. People now like to blame the Palestinians, but the Israelis were funding a group called the Phalangists, whose founder, Pierre Gemayel, went to the Berlin Olympics in 1936 and was really inspired by what he saw and decided to go and establish himself a group called the Phalangists, inspired by the Nazi ideology. And these people were a particularly heinous group. And we'll get onto them in full later, but what I first want to talk about is how Israel actually tried to implement this. Now, you could have the example of 1984 1982, where Israel attempted to break the back of Palestinian nationalism by targeting the Palestine Liberation Organization. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin made the claim, oh, these evil terrorists want to do a second Holocaust to us. In fact, on the eve of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, he literally said that there would be another Treblinka if Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Liberation Organization weren't destroyed, claiming that, they were evil terrorists who must be dealt with. And the justification, by the way, for invading Lebanon was the assassination of an Israeli diplomat, Shlomo Argov, who was targeted whilst in London, and although he did survive, he never really got out of bed again and he went on to die. But this guy wasn't even targeted by the PLO, he was targeted by a member of Abu Nidal, an anti-PLO organization. And so Israel, for this, went and invaded Lebanon. They went to destroy the PLO and went to try and set up a state where the Christian Maronites, particularly the Phalangists, would rule over the country. And in order to do this, Israel enacted a heinous bombing campaign that does not come close to anything that any Lebanese government or militant group have ever done to Israelis. On one singular day of bombing, on August the 12th, 1982, Israel killed 500 civilians in a singular day of bombing of Beirut. And this reached the point where Ronald Reagan, a staunchly pro-Israel Republican president, called Menachem Begin and told him that the symbol of his war was becoming a 7-month-old baby with its arms blown off, and he also told Begin that he was committing a Holocaust in Lebanon because of how atrocious the things that he was doing to the Lebanese people were. And this was all really horrifying, but eventually Israel managed to get the PLO out of the country. But this wasn't good enough for Israel. Israel's leadership was very obsessed with the idea that some of the Palestinian Liberation Organization fighters remained within Lebanon, which really wasn't true. I mean, there are other accounts from senior Israeli officials that say the exact opposite, that there were maybe a few people left, but it wasn't major. But for Ariel Sharon, Israel's Minister of Defense, well, this just wasn't acceptable, and he told Morris Draper, an American diplomat, when he told him that he didn't want to see people being killed by the Lebanese in camps, we will kill them. They will not be left there. You are not going to save them. You are not going to save these groups of international terrorism. If you don't want the Lebanese to kill them, we will kill them. And even though one of the conditions for PLO militants leaving Lebanon had been that Palestinian civilians would have been protected, Israel didn't abide by this, and those Phalangists that I mentioned earlier, well, their leader, Gemayel, was assassinated, and of course the PLO were blamed, even though it wasn't them. And so Israel and Ariel Sharon let the Phalangists go into the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps and perpetrate mass rape, mass torture, summary executions, mutilation of bodies, alleged stories where the fetus was cut out of a pregnant woman's belly and left on the floor, people stabbed, babies stabbed. I mean, the scale of it was far bigger than October the 7th. Perhaps up to 3,000 or 3,500 people were killed inside these camps. And you may be saying, well, Israel didn't do it, that's okay. Well, they fired flares in the air so the Phalangists could do it. They knew what the Phalangists were doing. They were the ones who had trained the Phalangists, armed them, they controlled the area, let them go in. In fact, a Norwegian who was in the area at the time said that the IOF had full view of a bulldozer digging a mass grave. And in fact, this wasn't even the first time that the Phalangists had been allowed to do this. In Tel al-Zata, 1,500 Palestinian and Lebanese civilians were massacred. And often people like to claim that, Israel's gone down this dark path. Maybe they highlight how the Likud party in particular has turned Israel into this horrible place. But the Labour Party in Israel in the 1970s had no problem with the Tel al-Zata massacre. In fact, this is what Likud members were saying to members of the Labour Party in the 1980s in the wake of Sabra and Shatila. Ariel Sharon would go on to say, "We did not criticise you for supporting the Christians. I am talking about a moral aspect. You kept on supporting the Christians even after the Tel al-Zata massacre. The information about the massacre and its cruelty was in everyone's possession." Sharon told member of the Knesset Yitzhak Rabin, "We had already known what they had done with the weapons we supplied and the forces we helped them build. However, we did not criticise you." And this is how both political parties in Israel dealt with massacres of Palestinian and Lebanese civilians that eclipse anything on the scale of October the 7th. And inside Israel proper, there was actually a very big reaction to what had happened in Sabra and Shatila. There was a march with 400,000 people, a rather large percentage of the Israeli adult population. And as a result, Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon stepped down from their positions after the Israeli Kahan Commission found that they were both complicit in Sabra and Shatila. But the Israelis still went on to elect Ariel Sharon as their prime minister in 2002, and he oversaw more slaughter of Palestinians, more destruction of their lives and townships. And yet you sit here and you cannot understand why someone might say, well, actually, yeah, a Lebanese person has a much different experience to that of an Israeli. Israelis have sat pretty. Yes, they have experienced violence and civilians being killed, but nothing on the scale of what Israel has done to Lebanon. And Israel did this not in pursuit of terrorists, but to alter the politics of the region, to set up a state there that was sympathetic to them, that might normalize relations with them. And you sit there and act as if Lebanon are the aggressors. It is frankly disgusting. It is like how you cannot understand how the Do Not Worry podcast was not upset at all about Israelis fleeing a rocket attack and a siren. The reason that people from the region think like this is well documented in an article by Norman Finkelstein in the early 1990s about Palestinian reactions to Saddam Hussein firing Scud missiles at Israel. And when he asked them why did they whoop and cheer at the prospect of Israeli civilians being targeted, all of them said it wasn't really actually about civilians being killed. It was Israelis feeling like they did for once. Feeling like they did when their homes were bombed and destroyed, experiencing the fear and terror of Israeli raids and oppression. For that one moment, Israelis had to experience what every single Lebanese person has experienced through bouts of mass slaughter. And even then, just hearing sirens and getting to hide in your bunker doesn't compare to what Israel has done to the Lebanese people. And this is why it just irks me so much that Ethan sits there and talks about history, because anyone with any knowledge of history should be able to say, well, actually, what the IOF have done to Lebanese people far eclipses what has ever been done to Israeli civilians, and any politics must therefore centre the people of Lebanon, the people of Palestine, rather than the feelings of Israeli people. And Ethan, if you want to see the distinction that you make between us and them, which was the centre of my previous video, you are so quick to explain, well, Israelis have difficult choices to make. All these crazy things happen there. People want to defend their homeland, and what was Israel supposed to do after October the 7th? But what were Lebanese people and Palestinians supposed to do after Sabra and Shatila? Or all those other mass bouts of slaughter? They never got revenge. They never got anything in return. They set up armed groups who you dismiss as violent and irrational monsters. But Israelis, well, it's understandable, and it's a fantasy to think that Israel may have to behave differently, even though they are the ones who have undeniably perpetrated the worst crimes against innocent civilians. And this is just where one of my key problems with Ethan lies. He just always centres Israeli feelings. He always goes on and on about anti-Semitism, which of course is most definitely a real thing that Jewish people experience. But Ethan, you sit pretty in Los Angeles right now. You are a multi-millionaire living in a mansion, and you are talking about your feelings. You highlight From the River to the Sea, and Gila chimes in and says, well, why don't they use a different slogan?
Talking about all Palestinian lands. Once again, that's funny because it's exactly related to what he accuses me of spreading Israeli propaganda about. My point is when Israelis hear From the Ocean to the Sea, they hear all of Israel. And guess what? That's what the guy from Hamas is saying on the screen of the clip you showed.
I don't understand. If a movement is for peace between two people and one people is telling you they're not comfortable with the statement, shouldn't we change the statement to something that both people can get behind?
No, because they'll say, peace. Right. Well, people will say that Israel's the aggressor, so they shouldn't have to adjust anything.
Yeah, but that's like, watered down American version of what's happening there.
Once again, the people who do nothing wrong when it comes to Palestine can't admit that Israel is an aggressor. Both of them think that Israel occupies Palestinian land illegally, settles it, perpetrates genocide and all of these things, but they don't see these as aggressive acts which provoke retaliations against Israel. Instead, that's a watered down American understanding of Palestine. But ultimately, the call from the river to the sea is a demand for the liberation of all of historic Palestine, not just the occupied territories. Ethan and Gila seem to have absolutely no problem with the 1948 Nakba, the fact that 750,000 Palestinians were expelled, many of them were sent on death marches, and since they have never been allowed to return. Many people still languish in refugee camps in places like Jordan, Syria and Lebanon, not being allowed to return to their homes. The people of Gaza, some of them can literally see where their homes and lands once were, but they're now occupied by Israelis. So the call from the river to the sea is not problematic, rather it is a demand for full Palestinian liberation. People are being burnt alive right now en masse in Palestine, children by the dozen, homes being collapsed on entire families, people are being tortured in Israeli jails to death, including minors. And yet you want to talk about your feelings and whether a slogan is offensive to Israeli people. I am sorry, but Israelis en masse are not opposing what is happening in the Gaza Strip. There's been no mass dissent. It's only really come recently when they're worried about the fate of Israeli hostages. There has been no mass disobedience over the last 18 months in Israel. There has been no major reaction against what Israel is doing. It's only really centered on their complaints around Netanyahu and the threats to Israel's faux democracy, and Netanyahu going full genocidal and making it obvious to the rest of the world what Israel always was. In fact, in that article by Norman Finkelstein, which I mentioned earlier, there is a fantastic quote from Mattiyahu Peled, who was a founding member of the Progressive List for Peace, talking about the Israeli peace movement, Peace Now, and what he said was that it's one of the worst things that ever happened to us. Nice people in Israel who feel unhappy with the situation but are not prepared to do anything about it. They get together twice or 3 times a year, and as the saying goes here, they give their conscience to the laundry. They get it back cleaned up and they go back home happy and satisfied. There is nothing more to it than that. They stand at a demonstration, they shout a few slogans, they go home satisfied that they have done the job, but they are not prepared to shake the system. So this is a substitute for real action. And I must remind you that Ethan and Gila have openly stated their opposition to people in Israel actually taking direct action against the Israeli occupation and the genocide in Gaza. Ethan said that it was a necessity to serve in the IOF.
It's important to serve like everybody else in the country. I mean, it's a very selfish move to decide, okay, I'm not going to do it, but everybody else will.
Like Israel as a place, the mentality of growing up there, like everybody feels an obligation to protect, to serve, to nurture this place that feels like the only place in the world where they can live and be Jewish and not be like discriminated against.
I mean, when you're growing up with constant terror attacks, the army is a necessity.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry if people think that's a controversial statement. That is the reality of Israel.
It's
and so for one person to decide, I'm not going to do it, is a very selfish decision. And it helps nothing with your career afterwards. You finish it, then you start
you don't even need to defend
life.
yourself. It's just normal.
They both said that it was a selfish thing to not do Israeli national service. And this is where the problem lies. Ethan loves to highlight, oh, there's loads of peaceful Israelis. But when they actually take an action, he's openly disagreed with the small handful of young people like Tal Mitnick who take action. A minimal action, I must remind you. Something which Tal even said to me himself. The organization Mesavrot is small, but it is growing inside Israel. There are more and more people who don't want to be complicit in Israel's occupation, their genocidal crimes in the Gaza Strip. And yet, as I say, Ethan said that this was a selfish thing to do. It is utterly ridiculous. And their argument, by the way, for it being selfish was that, oh, it's not actually good for your career to be in the IOF. This is categorically untrue. It is a good thing. Many people who have served in parts of the IOF, such as Unit 8200, have gone on to get illustrious jobs working for companies like Google. And if you ever wanted to see how awful Ethan really is at confronting even mild criticism of him, one part of iDubbbz's video was dedicated to talking about Ethan's button, the kill switch. And what iDubbbz had to say was that Ethan should have corrected his behaviour, and Ethan did talk about this in the second podcast episode, and what he said was, oh, it saved us loads of money, and oh, you shouldn't show things to the world, we all wish we could have one. But I'm going to be honest, if I had a podcast, I don't think that I would say half the things that Ethan does, or that I would constantly need to censor myself. In fact, I've been live over and over again, and I haven't once thought, oh god, I wish I could have paused that live, because I actually care about what I'm saying. I know and understand politics, and I don't just say whatever I want because I'm not a moron. But the funniest part is that it is very clear in the first part of Ethan's video that he literally used the button in the way that iDubbbz criticised him for. He used it like a tyrant, and a few extra seconds that were available on Spotify give us just a little glimpse into how Ethan treats his employees when they dare to confront him.
Authorities block healthcare to Gaza. Again, I'm not. Do you think that I'm talking about walking around Gaza when I say how great multicultural it is?
We
did
never
you think
defended
that?
how Israel attacked Gaza since October 7th, not even once. We never
I think that's
co-signed what they did.
Is that not the point he's making though?
What?
That you're talking about how nice Israel is, but
Israel proper is different
are-
from Gaza.
Yeah,
Right,
no,
but
I
at a
understand.
time,
Millions
like right now, say
Muslims in
I
Israel.
guess that's where.
As you can see, AB for raising a reasonable criticism and highlighting what iDubbbz was actually trying to say about Ethan was shouted down by both Ethan and Healer, and then Ethan proceeded to hold down the button for 45 seconds, which by the way is triple the length of what it normally does, no doubt to chastise AB as he previously did at another point. And after this point, AB didn't appear in the podcast, and Olivia, who also spoke up, didn't say anything else. In fact, AB seemingly didn't even return for the second podcast episode. Perhaps he was expelled by Ethan for daring to criticize him over his terrible views. And I don't think you could ever ask for a better example of why Ethan will never watch a video by someone like me, because all of my criticism is well researched. Ethan has absolutely no response to it, because he is someone who doesn't actually know anything about Israel, Palestine, or politics. This is just a guy who speaks from having lived in Israel for a bit, whose wife literally served the Israeli occupation, which he claims he opposes. Ethan acts as if people target him on the basis of anti-Semitism. But Ethan, it is not because of anti-Semitism. It is because you are unwilling to confront that you have ever done anything wrong. I mean, he tries to dismiss the Yoav Gallant thing here.
Gallant wanted to end the war. In the headlines at the time, he was in the headlines for opposing Netanyahu and wanting to end the war. That's what he was in the headlines for, and that's what we're referring to. We misspoke. It didn't sound good. We immediately corrected ourselves. You know, that's how mature people do. That's how how you're supposed to handle yourself, isn't it? Like, what more do you want me to do?
I have no problem apologizing and admitting and whatever is needed when things happen.
Him and Healer give an explanation that, oh, we apologise for it and it's okay, even though Ethan did actually take to his story to defend what Healer had actually said on the podcast, and she also tried to claim that the clip of her saying "I mean" in response to hearing Rudy Giuliani talk about Palestinians being trained to kill Americans from a very young age was somehow not true. And let's here be as charitable as possible to Ethan and Healer and say, yeah, you know what, these two were just mistakes and that's okay, you definitely didn't mean them, and they definitely aren't unacceptable. Well, this isn't even the half of what you two have said. As I highlighted in my previous video, Ethan has said over and over again that he is proud of what his wife did in the IOF. He says, oh, take the context out, I'm proud of it. She literally served the occupation. He said that Hamas uses and hides in hospitals and that isn't even up for debate, even though that claim is totally untrue and inaccurate and is literally facilitating Israel's genocide right now. I mean, Israel just bombed the Al Ahli Baptist Hospital. They just blew up the Turkish Cancer Hospital. They are expelling people from hospitals under this faux idea that they are Hamas bases. And this is a key facet of Israel's genocide. The destruction of healthcare infrastructure within Gaza so people cannot live there. And you, Ethan Klein, defended it. And rather than avow that, you claim that people just go after you because of anti-Semitism, that all you do is show sympathy for Israelis. It is so ridiculous and utterly pathetic. Even the clip which AB was responding to shows the problem with you, because what Ethan said was that it is okay to go to Israel proper, which refers to Israel that is not the occupied territories of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip and Golan Heights, but actually just Israel proper, which refers to the 48 borders of Israel. And he says, well, I think there's an apartheid in all these other places. I think that there's a genocide and all these horrifying things going on. But I think that Israel proper is an inspiring example of coexistence.
It's not weird. They live together, you know. In the West Bank and in Gaza, it's a completely different story, which I say. But I think it's inspiring that you see that it's possible. It is possible for Arabs and Muslims and Jews to live together in harmony, and they do in Israel proper.
But Ethan, to say that you think that there is apartheid in the West Bank and Gaza, you also forgot East Jerusalem, which is also illegally occupied by Israel, by the way, Mr. Historian, Mr. Expert. But if you genuinely think that, what you are saying here is like saying, well, South Africa proper is a shining example of coexistence because most of the oppression and racism is kept to the Bantustans. But Ethan, where do you think the people instituting the apartheid system are from? They live in Israel proper. Where do you think the government who decrees, yeah, we're going to do these things in the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem is from? Israel proper. They themselves literally believe that the West Bank is part of Israel. It's why they call it Judea and Samaria. It's a religiously motivated, fanatical dream that they deserve all of historical Palestine. And they are administering apartheid there. So for all intents and purposes, this is part of Israel proper. You can't just dismiss it and say, well, I like it there. It is, as I say, like saying you liked South Africa whilst it was an apartheid state because they did most of the bad things on the Bantustans. Every single year, there is a Death to Arabs march in Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of Israelis, including government officials by the way, congregate in the streets to march through the Arab section, chanting death to Arabs, may your village burn, smashing up Palestinian shops and attacking Palestinian shop owners. And that to you is a shining example of coexistence where you want to take your kids. I am sorry, Ethan. The vast majority of Israelis support the genocide in the Gaza Strip. The vast majority of Israelis support Israel's plan to expel 2 million Palestinians. You cannot reconcile and pretend, yeah, all the bad things just happen in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. No, Ethan, this is what Israel proper looks like.
Again, and this is what I'm saying. They're acting like Israel proper, which there's 2 million Palestinians living there in Israel with full rights. People just lie about the conditions there. They say that like Israel or Palestinians are second-class citizens in Israel, and or that like there's Jim Crow.
You go to universities. There are so many Muslim students, hospitals, Muslim doctors. It's like it's not what people portray
judges,
as
governments.
They are in the government.
But even then, this claim by Ethan and Healer that Israel proper is not some kind of apartheid state because, you know, they lived beside Arabs, there are Arabs in the government, is so funny. And I really just want to talk about this Arabs in the government thing. Because this is something Zionists always do. They always go, well, there's Arabs in the government. But they never actually know what these Arabs in government are saying. Because in 2018, Israel passed the nation-state law. And this is one of the reasons that you could never call Israel a shining example of coexistence, an inspiring example of coexistence, as Ethan puts it. Because this law said that settlement of Palestinian land was a national value, that only Jewish people were allowed to exercise self-determination, and also relegated Arabic to a language of special status but no longer an official language. And the reason that I bring up Arab members of the Israeli Knesset is because Ayman Odeh, the leader of the Arab opposition party, literally referred to this as a law which relegates Palestinians to being second-class citizens. So how dare you sit there and use this as some kind of example of, yeah, actually there's brilliant coexistence because they have politicians, when these people are literally criticizing it as a Jewish supremacist nation. You are so ridiculous. And this is what I mean when you can't avow that you've ever done anything wrong, that you have to sit there and pretend that it's, you know, minimal things, that it's only a couple of things. No, Ethan, it is a long pattern of spreading Israeli talking points to justify Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people. And on this topic of Jim Crow policies in Israel, here's a former American politician, Dov Zakheim, talking about how Israel's finance minister Bezalel Smotrich in 2023 tried to implement laws which he did successfully that were very similar to Jim Crow era, that targeted Palestinians, cut funding for their neighborhoods, which are already underfunded in Israel, by the way. And yet you just sit here and act as if it's only mega lefties that say this. Again, this guy worked for the US government. And then there are so many other laws within Israel proper that clearly just discriminate against Palestinians on the basis of their race. For example, there are family unification laws which are only applied to Palestinians. So if a Palestinian who lives in Israel proper marries a Palestinian who lives in the Gaza Strip or West Bank, Israel literally has a law since 2003 which has banned over and over again those families from reuniting inside Israel proper and often inside even the occupied territories. And the reason Israel does this is so they can expel Palestinians without having to do it, because if you really want to be with your partner, what are you going to do? You'll leave the country and Israel will never allow you to come back. And then you also have the very different ways in which Palestinians are surveilled in comparison to Israelis. Because when it comes to Palestinians, they can get arrested for social media posts showing solidarity with the people of Gaza. They could be arrested for, supporting Hamas. They could be thrown in jail for years, tortured, without trial, and so many other things. But when it comes to Israelis, well, you can appear on television and violate the UN Convention on Genocide Prevention, calling for all Palestinians to be wiped out, calling for them to be expelled, and that's just fine. You won't be arrested as you should be under the UN Convention. No, you might be given a new job, you might be promoted. Maybe Netanyahu will let you go carry out the genocide. And so do you not see that Palestinians cannot express dissent whereas Israelis can? They're affected by different laws. And yet you still sit there and call it a shining example of coexistence. Ethan, just because you lived there and lived alongside Palestinians, that did not mean that they lived equally. They cannot express full solidarity with the suffering Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, or any of these places, whereas Israelis can call for genocide. You are so ridiculous. As the 2018 nation-state law enshrines, these people have to say that, settlement of our land in the West Bank, well, that's just our national value, We can't exercise self-determination here. That's only for the Jewish people, because it's this wonderful space of coexistence, Now, as another means to avoid any questions about Ethan's actual ideology, he tried to make it seem as if all of the criticism against him was anti-Semitic. He claimed that Hassan had a swastika sword in his house, which him and his other crew members were endorsing, even though it was just a sword from a character in an anime. And he also tried to claim that iDubbbz was being anti-Semitic and engaging in Holocaust denial by talking about Israel's cultural appropriation of Palestinian food to try and make the Zionist project seem more Middle Eastern.
He's also doing, once again, almost a form of Holocaust denialism, which is basically diaspora apologia, basically saying that hummus is not Jewish food.
Oh.
He says there's no Arab distributors. Of
I don't
course
think
it's
that's
bad.
Holocaust denial.
No, I'm correcting myself because I think it's close. When you deny the Jewish the way that all 900,000 Jews were displaced.
Yeah, from other countries in the Middle East. I get that.
Denying that is, in my opinion, a form of Holocaust.
But the Holocaust is a specific thing that happened in Europe. You can just.
It's a way.
I think you need to
it's
frame it differently.
It's anti-Semitic historical revisionism. How about that?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, this is absolutely ridiculous, and Ethan loves to talk about the expulsion, the flight of Jewish people from the Middle Eastern countries. I mean, he never contextualizes it with, well, a lot of this was to do with the founding of the State of Israel, the degrading relationships between the two, and also the fact that why did Mizrahi Jewish people only start coming after the Second World War? Why weren't they welcomed really really at any point before that, because the only point they had been, some Yemeni Jewish people were brought on in very early. They were treated with horrific racism, even with spiritualist left-wing Zionists like Ahad Ham, Asher Ginsburg. You can literally read what he thought about Yemeni Jewish people here. Or you could read this quote from David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, in the 1960s, when he said, "The Moroccan Jew took a lot from the Moroccan Arab. The culture of Morocco I would not like to have here, and I don't see what contribution present Persians have to make. We do not want Israelis to become Arabs. We are in duty bound to fight against the spirit of the Levant, which corrupts individuals and societies and preserve the authentic Jewish values as they crystallized in the diaspora." And this fits perfectly with what the Zionist project did. They only brought Mizrahi people over after the Holocaust because Europe was closed off to Jewish immigration, and when they welcomed them over, they treated them horribly. There are so many examples of this, like the Yemeni baby affair, where Yemeni children were stolen from Jewish parents, and then the parents were told that the children had died, even though they had not died, and they'd actually been given to Ashkenazi couples. And the people who fought against this, like Uzi Meshulam, a Yemeni rabbi, was treated like an evil conspiracy theorist, even though he was proved right, and Israel apologized only a few years ago. And I'd also like to highlight this quote from a senior Israeli politician, which discusses Israel's motivation in evacuating Jewish people from the Arab countries. And it says that the need was not the need to rescue them, but the need to create a Hebrew majority in Eretz Yisrael. And there you have it. Ethan, you speak about this as if it was some uniform expulsion that came out of nowhere, that it is somehow akin to the Holocaust, that it is revision of Jewish history to talk about, yeah, Israel didn't actually want this culture and has only recently embraced it as a means to try and demonstrate that it is not a settler colonial nation, because people like you think that colonizers can only be white. But in reality, the expulsion and the existence of Mizrahi people within Israel is very complex. You could actually read people like Ella Shohat, herself an Iraqi Jewish person, talking about this, or you could just carry on listening to Israeli state propaganda. And this would be the key point, Ethan. Of course, Mizrahi Jewish people participated in Arab culture. They lived and existed within that environment for hundreds of years. But Israel appropriates their culture and uses it as a means to make themselves seem more Middle Eastern, even though it is a settler colonial project that, as its early leaders put it, was a means to extend Europe into the Middle East. It wasn't just Herzl. Max Nordau said exactly the same things. So when you sit there and go, well, it's anti-Semitic Holocaust revisionism to talk about this, it's just utterly ridiculous. And also, Ethan justified supporting Israel by claiming that 80% of Israeli Jews had nowhere else to go. I mean, what that means, I don't know. But it's important to note here that many people who actually work in the One Democratic State campaign, yes, not just saying one democratic state, people who actually are working towards this, discuss how this future will include all Israelis and Palestinians. The right of return for Palestinians will be implemented, but not with mass expulsion of Jewish people who actually live in historic Palestine. However, at the same time, I would like to read a quote from the Israeli historian Tom Segev. Segev recently wrote, "At the age of 80, I'm starting to think that maybe it wasn't right from the outset, the whole Zionist thing. Most Israelis are refugees or the offspring of refugees, not Zionists but refugees. So you'll say, well, that justifies Zionism because this was a land they were able to come to. But we need to remember that the majority of the Holocaust survivors did not come to live in Israel, and that the majority of Jews in the world are not coming to Israel. They can, but they don't want to live in this country. So Zionism is not such a great success story. It also doesn't provide security to Jews. It's safer for Jews to live outside Israel." And Ethan, you proved this in your video. You say that you've had to cancel your trip to Israel because you don't want your children to be exposed to potentially rocket sirens or something else happening inside Israel.
A peace
We put the
deal or something to go into effect.
Yeah, we put the visit off while the war is
Because we want
happening.
to come with the kids and
I don't want them to have to deal with sirens and
yeah.
seeing all that shit and hearing all that shit, you know?
But that's just not going to happen to them inside America. You and your children are incredibly safe. You are not going to be subjected to violence because although America is a settler colony, it doesn't have an open frontier of settlement right now. And as many of the most eminent historians who discuss the concept of the frontier have noted, any time frontiers expand, it provokes violence. And so as long as Israel keeps on expanding into Palestinian land, it is always going to be met with violence. It is never going to be this safe and wonderful project as you try and make out. It is a complete and utter failure, and your desire to cling to the state of Israel and act as if it is wonderful, a beacon of coexistence, is frankly ridiculous. It is a state that was begun with the expulsion of 750,000 people, the instant removal, lightning quick, of 750,000 people. Israeli settlers literally moved into Palestinian homes. They took pots, pans, photo albums, everything that you could possibly imagine from people's homes. So Ethan, anyone who is genuinely committed to Palestinian liberation is of course against anti-Semitism. None of us support the extermination of Jewish people on the basis of their race. This is the whole basis of the rejection of Zionism. We reject the Zionist project because it is an ethno-supremacist project which has justified the extermination of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and the expulsion and destruction of the lives of millions more. Israel now heads towards expelling 2 million Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. It is increasingly looking like it will probably end up doing something similar in the West Bank and East Jerusalem in the near future, and perhaps one day it will try and do it inside Israel proper as well. So why you cling to this state is beyond me. You cannot sit there and say, well, most Jews are Zionists and that makes it okay. The statistic that 90% of Jewish people are Zionists isn't even correct. But if it were, it wouldn't change anything. I'm sure that many white people supported apartheid. I'm sure that many white people didn't see a problem with colonialism. But we do now. We have grown and we have changed. And I see Zionism for what it is. It was always a movement premised on the fact that the Palestinian people, who made up the vast majority of the inhabitants of that land, did not have a right because they were further from the proximity to Europeans. I mean, as I noted in a previous video, it's what Arthur Balfour said. He said that he didn't care what the 700,000 Palestinians wanted, even though they were the majority. What mattered to him was what Jewish people who did not live in that land wanted. And this is why I have to question what point there is in supporting Israel. There will always be Jewish people who exist there. Ethan tries to dismiss the idea that Israel is a state which says that it represents all Jewish people. He says, I don't think Israel have ever said that. Netanyahu categorically has said that at certain points. He said it whilst he was in Paris in 2015. He said that he was the representative of all Jewish people there. Israel refers to itself as a Jewish state. They talk about policies of Judaizing, where they move Jewish people into the land. They say that Jewish settlement is a national value. They welcome every single Jewish person from all across the world, even if they don't have links to the land of Palestine. You yourself, Ethan, could go there and settle there, even though your ancestors didn't live there, because it is a state for Jewish people. So this idea that Israel somehow has never said that it is a Jewish state, when it uses the Star of David, a Jewish symbol, as its flag, as it has over and over again talked about how it has revitalized the Jewish people, is farcical. I mean, I don't even understand why you are doing this at this point, Ethan. Why are you saying these things? Ultimately, it is not the state of Israel which matters. States do not have innate rights to exist. They are creations of the human mind. There have always been Jewish people living in historic Palestine. However, this amount was small until the Zionist project came with the explicit goal of settling Palestinian land and establishing a settler colony there that would not include the Palestinian indigenous society. And Israel, throughout its entire history, has moved closer and closer to the erasure of Palestinian culture in that land. So Ethan, don't bother clinging to the state. Israel is not some wonderful guarantee that all Jewish people will be safe. There's actually a fantastic article by an Israeli called Boaz Evron, written in the 1980s, where he talks about how this idea that it is the state which will protect Jewish people is farcical, because millions of other people were slaughtered during the Holocaust who had actual states. Polish people, people from Russia, the Soviet Union. People were slaughtered regardless of being protected by an army. What mattered to Evrom was the goal of moving towards stamping out the kind of ideologies that led to Nazism, the kind of justifications for subjugating others. And unfortunately, this is all the Zionist project is. From its very inception, it has always been premised on the fact that the indigenous Palestinian society was not deserving of the land, and thus, in order to move forward, you must abandon Zionism.